Good morning, everybody. Hope you guys are doing well on this Tuesday, first day after a 3-day weekend for some of us. And we are going to get right back on the horse here with head coaching candidates, and we're going to go to another popular, well known one that a lot of people are at the very least interested in, at the very least discussing. It's Mike Vrabel, recently fired by the Tennessee Titans. This is a guy who has had success and some very impressive success at the head coaching level in the NFL before. This is a guy who has worked his way up in the NFL coaching trees. This is a guy who started out as a very well known player. I remember his playing career very well. So, actually, to look at Mike Vrabel and see that he's only 49 years old, that surprises me. He feels like a guy who should be in his late 50s because I've seen him for so long. I remember when he was playing linebacker for New England and I think Kansas City at the end of his career. So it's very weird for me to say he's sub 50, but this is still a relatively young candidate. So when you're talking about Vrabel, you're obviously mostly going to focus about on his most recent 6 seasons where he was the head coach in Tennessee for the Titans, and he actually did fairly well. He started out with 4 straight winning seasons before petering out these last two. But how did he actually do as a head coach? We know the basics, right? We do know that he won head coach of the year in 2021. We know he coached in the AFC title game in 2019. We know that he was partially responsible for turning Ryan Tannehill's career around. He took over a team that was not particularly good from I think it was Malarkey, I believe it was, before he was there. So it was a pretty impressive run, and it seems like some issues with the ownership and front office resulted in him being let go more than his own incompetence. Now, that being said, the last 2 years were not great. However, overall, if you look at Mike Vrabel as a defensive guy, which he is a defensive coach, the defense wasn't really that bad for most of the years if you're just looking at points per game. Even this most recent season when they went 6-11 and they were bad, they were still 16th in points allowed, 21.6 points per game. Not too bad. It is worth noting that EPA was far less kind to his resume. They actually think the Titans had one of the worst defenses in the league by EPA this year, 28th. So that's a little bit alarming, right? That has to be at least a little bit concerning. And then 2022, which is when the bad Titans really came out, kind of the same thing almost. You have a defense that is approximately average or slightly above average in this case by points per game, 21.1. But then you have a well below average, maybe even bad EPA of 0.015 per play. So you're getting kind of two different stories here depending on what stat you want to use. Now, 2021 was certainly his best year. The Titans had a almost top 5 defense in points per game, 20.8, and they had a negative 0.018 EPA on defense, which was 10th. So it was a good defense no matter how you slice it. He did great work. They went 12-5. Tannehill ran out of gas in the playoffs. They went one and done. Unfortunate, but Vrabel definitely did a good job this year. The one year that the Titans defense was actually really bad was 2020, where oddly enough they actually still did well. Their defense was bad in terms of points per game, 27.4, and EPA was also really bad, 0.131, 28th in the league. So pretty awful in that regard. But they still went 11-5 on the back of a good offense with Arthur Smith and Tannehill. So read into that how you will. But the first 2 years that Vrabel was there, the defense was quite good. It was third in points per game his first year, after being, I think, middle of the league the previous season. They went 9-7. They had a negative 0.016 EPA, 10th. Year before it was 15th, and he was 12th in points per game. So respectable, decent, solid. He never had an over-the-top great defense in Tennessee, but you can see that overall it was pretty good, even when the team was bad. And I think this is a pretty respectable resume of being a head coach. And I want to stress this. He did not get fired because he was bad as much as he got fired because he and Tennessee kind of mutually wanted to part ways because there had been some things that had happened within that team that I think had frustrated him. Like, he didn't want to trade A.J. Brown. I don't think he wanted to draft Malik Willis. And those moves being made kind of helped get him to the point where he is right now. So before his Tennessee stint, he was in Houston, and he had 1 year as a defensive coordinator in 2017, and that was actually a disaster. The Texans' defense was the worst in the league by points per game in 2017, 27.3 points a game. And they were also very bad in EPA, 27th, 0.031. So it's actually kind of interesting that this guy was able to get a head coaching job off of this. Like, he went from a linebacker coach who did well overall, it seems, to a defensive coordinator who had one awful year, and then boom, he's a successful head coach. Kind of funny how sometimes these guys get to jump the line. But before being a DC, he was actually a really prolific linebacker coach. From 2014 to 2016, he was the linebacker coach in Houston. Houston had good defenses throughout these 3 years. By EPA, they were actually elite. Negative 0.115 in 2014. In 2015, this is supposed to be negative 0.102. And then in 2016, negative 0.053. And their points per game rankings were always pretty good, 11th, 7th, 7th. So it was a good defense all 3 years. And look at some of the linebackers that he was working with during this time. Some of these guys you guys might not remember too well. Benardrick McKinney, Whitney Merciless, John Simon, Mike Mohammed, Brooks Reed. Not big names in the linebacker world at this point. I do remember Brian Cushing very well because of the steroid stuff. And, of course, I know Jadeveon Clowney. But it was not exactly the greatest crop of linebackers that he had to work with, and he got really good things out of them. So that was an impressive stepping stone for him in his NFL career. And before then, he was a defensive line coach for the Ohio State Buckeyes. Ohio State had a good, not great defense those 2 years. 22.6, 22.8 points per game, so right around 30th or so in the league. Some of the defensive linemen he coached during his time at Ohio State included the great Joey Bosa, Noah Spence, Adolphus Washington, John Simon, and Jonathan Hankins. All of those guys would go on to become picks within the first 5 rounds of their respective drafts. Joey Bosa, of course, was a very early pick. Jonathan Hankins was, I think, a second-round pick. So some notable guys that he touched base with during his time at Ohio State. And the year before that, he was a linebacker coach for Ohio State. Again, Ohio State that year had a good, not great defense, 27th, 21 points per game in 2011. The main guy that he coached during his time at Ohio State, who would go on to be a very prolific player, was Ryan Shazier, who was a first-round pick at one point. Of course, his career came to a very abrupt and unfortunate end, but Ryan Shazier was kind of his big project guy that he really helped develop. And that's it. That's the whole resume. We're going back not even a decade and a half. Pete Carroll was the Seahawks head coach, while Mike Vrabel was still, I think, playing football in the NFL for Kansas City. So there's not a ton to say here. You would say that what he did at Ohio State was pretty good. What he did as the Houston linebacker coach was pretty good. And what he did as the Tennessee head coach was good. Maybe even really good. It's not exactly like... Tennessee's not exactly a perennial powerhouse, and he made them credible for about 4 seasons there. And through most of 2022, they were good, and then they just completely ran out of gas. So I'm not super gassed about this potential hire, but I put it on about the same level for me as like a Dan Quinn. And I know a lot of people are going to hear that and go, oh, I must be really down on him. I'm not. I'm more down on Dan Quinn than I was before. I think we can do better, but I'm not going to completely abandon Dan Quinn and think that, oh, he's terrible now because of one really bad game. I'm still kind of in the same place with him where I think we can do better, but I understand the appeal. That's where I am with Vrabel. I think we can do better, but I understand the appeal. This is a guy who will get the team up and ready to play every week, no matter what. No doubt about that. He's going to be able to definitely motivate the team well, and he's got a decent track record. I don't know about him as an X's and O's guy. Obviously, he had his greatest success in Tennessee with Arthur Smith, so you know he's going to need a really good offensive coordinator. So hopefully we can provide that. I don't think he's going to be able to provide that on his own, although Arthur Smith is currently out of a job. Hint, hint. If you get Vrabel, maybe you get Arthur Smith. And Arthur Smith is the guy who turned Ryan Tannehill into an elite quarterback for a couple years. So I don't mind this one. It's uninspiring to me, admittedly. There is something a little bit lacking here. I feel like you could do better, but I also cannot doubt this track record of repeated solid performance from his defenses. So I'm open to it. I'm not going to be mad if we get him, but I am going to feel like, is this really that different than what we just had? And don't get me wrong, I'm happy to have pretty much any coach that is not Pete Carroll, because here's the thing that people are missing. Even if the coach you bring in is worse than Pete Carroll, he's easy to fire. Pete Carroll was not easy to fire because he was so important to this organization. If you bring in Mike Vrabel or Dan Quinn and they suck, they can get out of here real quick. 2-3 years, boom, you're out of here. You don't even have to think about it because who cares? With Pete Carroll, people cared. There are people out there who think that Pete Carroll should have been able to lose every game, every single season, and still not get fired because he's Pete Carroll. You don't fire a guy like that. But nobody would say that here about a guy like Vrabel or Quinn. So, good resume, little bit short, little bit underwhelming in some areas. Like, again, the fact that he never had an elite defense in Tennessee. Like, he had 2 defenses that were top 10 in EPA, and they were not top 9. They were literally 10th. That makes me wonder. Compared to a guy like Dan Quinn, who's put together 5 top 5 EPA defenses in his career alone. But I'm not going to dismiss it. All right, see you guys later. Go Hawks. More coaching talk coming soon.